Hello and welcome back to CHY4U History of the West and the World at Discovery Academy. My name is Arseny Koshever, and today we're going to conclude our introduction at the state of Europe before the beginning of Renaissance. In the last lecture, we took a look at how technology, society, literature, art, culture uh, looked like in Europe at the time and how they slowly began to change. Today, we're going to take a look at just three of the dramatic events that made these changes possible and that brought about the Renaissance. By far, the most important one of these were the Crusades. And the Crusades were a series of military campaigns which were approved by the Catholic Church, and the goal was to conquer Jerusalem and Palestine, what is today Palestine, for the Christian faith. And the issue was that for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, Jerusalem is a very important city. It is the holy city, the center of the world in Christian and Judaic traditions, and it is also a very important city for Muslims for religious reasons at all, as well. Sorry. For example, the one of the great mosques, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is located in Jerusalem. It is considered a holy city by them as well. And the problem was is that for a long time, Muslims allowed Christians to travel freely to Jerusalem, to live in Jerusalem, uh, and visit the holy sites. But the Muslim world came into conflict with the Byzantine Christians. They were basically a Greek empire in what is today the Balkans and Turkey. And slowly, the Muslim attitudes towards Christians began to change, just as the Christian attitudes towards Muslims began to change as well. And as this conflict, as this animosity between the Byzantines and the Muslims began to grow, uh, one of the ways in which the Byzantines tried to get help was to appeal to the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope by claiming that the Muslims were preventing Christians from visiting their holy city of Jerusalem. It was also a convenient excuse for both the Roman Catholic Church and the kings in Europe to go on these crusades to try and conquer a part of the Muslim world. For one thing, it was considered to be a very wealthy part of the world at the time. So there were a lot of riches that could be taken. For another reason, Europe, as I mentioned, had was under feudal system at the time. And the system worked as long as there was enough land. But when there isn't enough land, then you start to have a problem. And Europe, Western Europe, was starting to have that problem. There were too many people, in a way. Too many people to feed, too many people to have land. They had to go somewhere, otherwise there's going to be a lot of problems. By pointing these people, landless people, at Jerusalem and the Muslim world, it helped channel these social problems away from Europe. So the real reasons for crusade were really overpopulation, greed, xenophobia, the hatred that the Europeans that had towards non-Christians at the time, and also to distract the population from well how bad their life really was. And the Crusades lasted for roughly 200 years, although there were some crusades after that as well, but they were very short. And although the Crusaders were very successful at first, later on they were defeated when the Muslims uh, finally managed to unite behind an effective leader and defeat the Europeans. But even though the Europeans were ultimately unsuccessful in keeping Jerusalem, what happened was a lot of Europeans, for the first time in their life, traveled outside of Europe and they started interacting with other cultures, not just the Muslim cultures, but also Jewish culture, Berber culture, uh, Turkish, what will eventually become the Turkish culture, and others. They were exposed to new ideas, new fashions, new technologies, new art and literature, and they brought it with them back to Europe. And that's going to be very, very important. At the same time that there were crusades in the Middle East, there were also crusades in Northern and Eastern Europe, where the Teutonic Knights, which were German crusaders, attacked Lithuania and Latvia to build a new German religious kingdom, and that would ultimately result in the creation, much later on, of Prussia. Europeans might have been unsuccessful, but the knowledge and riches, the wealth they brought back from the Crusades, got European society, technology, culture, and war to change. Another important dramatic event in European history at the time was the Reconquista. And in Spanish, Reconquista means reconquest. The problem was that Spain was not entirely Christian country at the time. In the north, you had several Christian kingdoms. For example, Catalonia, Aragon, Navarre. In the west, you had the Kingdom of Portugal. But in the south of Spain, you had the Muslim kingdom of the Almohads, who the Spanish called Moors, the Iberian Moors. And for almost 800 years, the Christian uh, the Christian Spanish in the north were fighting the Muslims, some of whom were Arabs, others were people of North Africa, and others were also indigenous Spanish, but who were Muslim instead of Christian. And this was an almost 800-year long war. And although this wasn't a continuous war, so there was a lot of cultural exchange between the Christians and the Muslims as well. But by the end of 15th century, the Reconquista was finally successful. Spanish victory defeated the uh, the Almohads. It established Spain as the most powerful kingdom in Europe because in order to win, Spain had to create Europe's most powerful army. So once once the Almohads are defeated, Spain is going to be looking at new opportunities in Europe or in the newly discovered America. The Reconquista, however, wasn't just aimed at the Arabs, at the Muslims in Spain, but also at any heretics, people who did not necessarily agree with what the Catholic Church was doing, and unfortunately the Jews as well. So it was a very brutal period. But what it did, it created Spain as the most powerful military power in Europe. It also meant that the Spanish crown, the Spanish political leaders, were now looking for new sources of wealth and conquest. So in 1492, when the last city of the Moors, Granada, was finally taken, Christopher Columbus set off sailing to the west. And finally, the last really big and dramatic event that completely changed European society and helped bring about the Renaissance was ironically the Black Death. The Black Death is the bubonic plague. It's still around today, but today we do have medicine uh, and antibiotics that can prevent it and can cure it. But back then, it was a mysterious and deadly and terrifying illness. The symptoms of Black Death were disgusting, they were incredibly painful, and most people who contracted the Black Death died. You had about a 90% chance of dying once you had the sickness. And the problem was made even worse by the fact that Europeans didn't know a lot about how diseases work. They didn't know much about how to make effective medicine or how the human body worked. The Black Death originally started in China, and the problem was that in China, at the time, the bubonic plague would appear once in a while. It would kill a lot of people and then would disappear. And over time, the Chinese population built up a limited immunity to it, so it wasn't quite as affected by this plague. But Europeans and other cultures and other ethnic groups were not as lucky. We know that there was an outbreak of the Black Death in China in 1338, and because there was trade from China to Europe through what's called the Silk Road, it started to spread. It spread at first to Afghanistan, or what is today Afghanistan. From there, it swept down into what is today India and Pakistan. Merchants traveling through the Silk Road carried it westward through Central Asia. From there, it spread to Middle East, and from Middle East, merchants from Italian city of Genoa contracted the plague. They didn't know they were sick. They got on a ship to go back to their homeland in Italy and brought it with them. It had an absolutely devastating effect on population in Europe and in the rest of the world. The world population was decreased by 100 million people. So that means that almost 1 in 4 people around the world died. It was the worst epidemic of its kind. In Europe, historians are still not entirely in agreement as to how many people died. I mean, they didn't exactly have computers and photo IDs and really good records, but on average, 1 in 3 people who lived in Europe during this period had died of the plague or hunger or other diseases that were brought about by the plague. Some places had high mortality. For example, there were places in Italy, in what is today Germany, where 1 in 9 people lived. So 8 out of 9 people died as a result. In some areas, if you can look at the map, the bright blue areas here, there was actually very little mortality. Very few people died of the plague. And then there were some parts of Europe that were relatively unaffected, especially the more northern parts of Europe, because the plague apparently, well, it doesn't like cold temperatures very much. And unfortunately, uh, because Europeans did not understand how diseases worked or how medicine or what kind of medicine might help, they felt powerless. They tried praying to God. Well, that didn't exactly work. So people blamed the plague on Jews, on Muslims. They blamed it on witches or the devil or evil spirits. Uh, as a result, many of these groups would suffer because people in Europe blamed them for all this death and tragedy. But on the other hand, what happened was plague helped destroy serfdom. As a lot of people died, and most of the people who died were actually peasants. Right? They were the poor people, the lower class people. And it presented a problem because it used to be that there were lots and lots of peasants. So you didn't really have to pay them much because there were just so many of them. But now there were fewer. And that meant you had to be more careful now. You didn't have quite as many workers as you did before, so maybe you need to start taking better care of it. The other thing that Black Death did, as we'll see when we discuss Renaissance, was that it also made people more concerned with improving their lives and enjoying the time that they have before they die. And that was also a big shift in European culture and European worldview. Next lesson, we're going to look at the beginning of Renaissance and start the first unit.